My name is Colby Brown, as Amy just said, and I've been working as a photographer for 12 years, including working for a while with National Geographic. And the interesting thing about my backstory is that I don't have some nostalgic story where my father handed me a camera when I was 7. It's what I always wanted to do. Instead, I kind of fell into photography because I had a love of travel. I realized early on that I liked being out of my comfort zone. I liked traveling around the world and finding myself in challenging environments. And that kind of point of origin of getting into this industry helped shape the type of work that I ended up doing. So as you can see here, it's kind of a wide variety of things between landscape, wildlife, travel, even some portrait work in there. And throughout this process, I found myself literally traveling to the 4 corners of the globe over the last 12 years, finding myself in situations where I'm working in harsh environments. I'm working in remote locations where I'm hiking into places. This is a photograph of a behind-the-scenes shot of a commercial that I was shooting with Travel Alberta up in the Canadian Rockies. We had to helicopter into this place called Mount Assiniboine, and then carry all of our gear up, carry all of our gear out there to sleep, all of our food and water, and then a snowstorm came during, it was just at the end of the season, right by autumn, and essentially had to create all this content in this remote location where we couldn't charge our batteries, we were away from civilization. And oftentimes I find myself in that happening a lot every single year. Q1 and Q2 I find myself up in the Arctic all the time. So this is a photo of one of my small teams working up in Lofoten, so Lofoten Islands in northern Norway, and this is above the Arctic Circle. And during this morning that I shot this, we literally went through 4 different seasons in about a 25 to 35 minute span. So it started off with a little bit of snow, turned into a full-on blizzard, turned into hail where we had to hide behind these rocks, and then all of a sudden the wind continued to come in, pushed everything out, and all of a sudden it was a beautiful, beautiful sunrise. But this is pretty common when I do work that high up in terms of positions in the earth. Now, a lot of people think that places like Lofoten or Norway are actually extremely cold. In reality, they're not. Because of the ocean currents, a lot of the temperatures out there are more so hovering around freezing, so it's still cold, but it's not frigid. The coldest I've ever been has actually been in Canada, especially when I go up there sometimes when polar vortexes has come through. This photograph, or these 2 photographs, are little selfies that I took when it was negative 56 degrees centigrade. So most people don't realize that when you get to about negative 34, negative 35, that centigrade and Fahrenheit actually equal each other and then begin to diverge as you continue to move on. So this was negative 56 degrees centigrade. And what happens at this stage is that any moisture in the air, especially around your face and around your eyes, will literally freeze on the spot and literally begin to freeze your eyelashes. And so I found it quite interesting that this was happening. I realized quite quickly that there was these small little frozen droplets on my eyes. Took a couple photos to showcase what it was like. But regardless, I had to figure out how to work, how to operate in this type of environment. Like how do you dress appropriately? Is your gear going to survive? What could you potentially do as a creative? Additionally, I find myself, as I mentioned, working in places where I am literally hiking into locations 10, 15, 25 kilometers in, having to pack and carry all of my stuff. So this is not necessarily just my camera gear. Sometimes it's water, food, sleeping bag, tent, everything. This particular area is, again, back in Canada. This is an area known as the Ramparts, which is part of Jasper National Park. And it was about a 15K hike in to get to this spot, again at the end of the season by autumn. And it was beautiful, but it required a lot of effort to get there. Additionally, places like Patagonia, which are kind of the bucket list location for a lot of landscape and travel photographers out there. This particular shot is of Cerro Torre and Laguna Torre in Los Glaciers National Park in Argentina. And this is about a 12K hike in to get back to this spot. I had to pack in all of our tents, camping gear. Didn't have to do the water because the water is actually super clean, so that saves a little bit of weight. But all of our food, and then camp out for about 6 days waiting for the light to be right at this one spot. And when it comes to this type of working remotely, it's not necessarily just the landscape working with and working in outdoor crazy environments. Sometimes it's also working with remote tribes. So I do work with, I've done work like this in places like Papua New Guinea, in Africa. This is in Tanzania, in a remote village. a couple miles outside of the Serengeti, Ngorongoro. I've done it in South America, kind of all over the place. And sometimes to get to these unique cultures that are getting fewer and far between, you have to really get off the grid to get out to those spaces. So what are some of the challenges that you face when you're working off the grid? Like what do you have to overcome? First and foremost, obviously, is that you literally are off the grid. You are working in environments where there's either not a lot of people or very little people out there, and you're generally not close to places where you can charge your gear easily, and you usually have to schlep your stuff out there. So this is a photograph of the Narrows in Zion National Park. Now, this particular place is not that far from Springdale, Utah. So some people would say that's not that far off the grid. But in reality, to hike up to the places in the Narrows is a couple kilometers, and depending on the time of year, depending on the rains that have happened near close proximity to that, you could have a situation like I did, where I'm 6'3", and in this photo you can see me wading through the water in a dry suit up to my hips. About an hour and a half later, at a different crossing point, it got up to my shoulders, and I have a picture of me holding my bag as I cross over. Now, that's not for everyone. Everyone can't necessarily do that, but it was a very challenging situation, not only physically to get back there, but to keep my gear safe and dry in the process. Weather. So like how do you handle adverse weather, whether it's cold, dust, rain, humidity? This is all the splashes in water happening right here were from underneath a waterfall in Iceland. So I literally had water dripping, like running off my camera as I was shooting out there. And this happens a lot. I've been shooting with Sony for 5 years, literally taking them to every continent in the world. And this is a regular occurrence. So how do you protect your gear? How do you feel confident in the gear that you're using? And what steps can you use to help mitigate any issues you might have? We're going to talk about that a little bit towards the end of the presentation. And then additionally, the other challenge that you face sometimes can be that idea of portability. So you want to have gear that doesn't weigh a lot, that doesn't force you to carry 40 pounds of gear. Now, I used to shoot digital SLRs back in the day. As I mentioned, I've been with Sony for 5 years now. But there was a point where I was up in the Himalayas, and I was about day 11 into a 22-day trek to get to this location I was getting to. And I distinctly remember, this was just a year before Sony announced the first generation of the A7 full-frame series. And I remember having this realization that there had to be a better option. I was sick and tired of carrying 60 pounds of gear, let alone all the other things that I needed to carry to get out to these spots. So initially, when I moved to mirrorless, portability was the #1 reason. Over the years, the technology and other things have not only caught up to everyone else out there, but exceeded most everything else out there happening in the industry right now. But initially, it's that idea of portability. How can you have a gear set? How is your gear bag not weighing you down, both figuratively and literally? So let's talk about that. What is in my gear bag? What gear do I use when I travel out to these different locations? Now I'm going to talk about both cameras and lenses. I don't carry all of these out every time I go off the grid, but they are usually at least a couple of these lenses and a few of the camera bodies are what I do bring out there. So to start things off, let's talk about Sony's full frame camera series. We have the A9, the A7 III, and the A7R III. So to me, the A9 is kind of like your premier sports wildlife camera, 20 frames per second, stacked CMOS sensor, which essentially gives you 20 times the readout speed from any other camera out there. Unbelievable autofocus speeds. It's a wonderful, wonderful wildlife camera, which is what I use it mostly for. The A7 III has a few of the features of the A9, such as the number of autofocus points, but it's a really great bang for your buck. It's a wonderful camera, 24 frames per second, 10 frames per second, 24 megapixels. And then the A7R III is kind of my bread and butter for this type of stuff. It's 42 megapixels. You get about 15 stops of dynamic range, also 10 frames per second. And it's kind of, if you're going for resolution and dynamic range for landscape type outdoor work, that's kind of what you want. That's what I use. I have a couple of those that I take on a lot of my trips. So let's talk a little bit about lenses. So this particular shot of a puffin taken in Grimsby Island, north of Iceland, again above the Arctic Circle, was taken with the Sony 70-200 f4 lens. Now the f4 lens is nice and light and also incredibly sharp. So if you're looking to save a couple ounces, the f4 version is actually a great opportunity or a great option if you don't need that f2.8. You don't need a faster lens in order to get certain types of background bokeh, you need to be able to slow your shutter speed down a little bit to compensate, which is when I usually bring the 70-200 f2.8 GM lens. Now the GM again is the G Master, so G Master is like Sony's premier glass. It's their best optical glass out there. And so I take that when I need situations where that extra stop of light from f4 to f2.8 makes a difference, such as when I'm shooting outside of, or out a window of a plane. This was taken over the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park, and it was a really windy day. So I had to crank that shutter speed up quite high, and I didn't want to further push my ISO up more than I needed to. So being able to drop down to 2.8, shooting at about 5,000 feet, I didn't have to worry about depth of field. So I was able to crank it down and not sacrifice too much ISO in the process. Now this photo is taken in Rena in Norway, Lofoten Islands again. This was taken with the 16-35 f4 Zeiss lens. Now the f4 version again is going to save you a bit of weight. It's still really, really sharp, especially in the center, and it kind of filters out throughout to the corners. It's a nice, great lens. It's portable, it's small, and lightweight. The only time, or the times where I really go for the 2.8 GM version, so the 16-35 2.8 GM, is when I'm doing a lot of night or astro work, photographing the northern lights, things like that. So this was taken again in Norway. Being able to shoot at f2.8 again allows you to drop your shutter speed down a little bit, keep your ISO down, depending on how much movement you're willing to get with both the aurora and stars in the process. Now this is in panorama, taken in Patagonia, taken with the Sony 24-70 f2.8 GM lens again. So it's a super sharp, great lens. It can also double in doing astro work because it's 2.8 and corner-to-corner sharpness that you get. In this particular scene, it was such a beautiful reflection happening in this shot. That's why I went for a panorama. So I was originally on my 16-35, and then I realized what was happening, realized that if I shot this at 16-35, because the lake is quite large, the mountains would have got really, really small. So instead I opted for the 24-70, shot the panorama with a 5-image stitched panorama, created about a 250 megapixel panorama image of this beautiful scene because that's what it called for. And then another one that I like to bring out, which most of the rest of them have been wildlife or landscape focus, is the Sony 85 G Master 1.4. Now it's my favorite travel portrait lens to use. This is taken of a man in Papua New Guinea in a remote tribe in the Sepik region. And as you can see, just the detail you get in the eyes for kind of things like eye autofocus, which I believe we'll talk about later, but the background blur is just beautiful. It's a phenomenal lens. It's a little bit, has a little bit more girth than the 1.8 version, than the non-GM, and it weighs a little bit more, but to me it's worth that extra weight in a scene like this, where if I'm schlepping my gear out there, or I'm going to a remote part like Papua New Guinea, I want to make sure that I have the right gear for the type of work that I'm going for. So key tools and features for working off the grid. So the first one I want to talk about is IBIS, so in-body image stabilization. And this is important to understand because in-body image stabilization is actually quite a bit different than lens stabilization. So a lot of other manufacturers out there will tout the fact that their lenses are stabilized, which yes is better than having a non-stabilized lens, but there are some differences. The first key difference is the fact that lens stabilization actually only gives you 2 axes of stabilization. So you get pitch and yaw. In-body stabilization that happens on the center, you get 5 axes. So you get much more leeway to shoot at lower shutter speeds and handle external vibration and things like that. Additionally, for a scene like this image was taken with the 16-35. How many 16-35 wide-angle lenses do you know that carry image stabilization inside the lenses themselves? Almost none. The reality is that you need, in order to take a scene like this, which was shot at 1/5 of a second on a 16-35 of this iceberg in Iceland, you need to have a camera that has in-body stabilization built into the sensor, which allowed me to not have to use a tripod because the tide was going in and out, to be able to get right up next to that iceberg, drop down, nail my focus, and get the shot, and it's tack sharp here on the iceberg, and get a nice little background blur with everything else happening in the background. You couldn't get this type of shot with another camera that doesn't have built-in image stabilization into the sensor itself. Now additionally, I want to talk about the dual card slots, but not necessarily for the reason you're probably thinking. So oftentimes when photographers talk about, talk about the necessity for dual card slots, they think about the reality that your SD cards might fail. Now, personally, in 12 years that I've been doing this, I may have had 1 or 2 cards fail. It can happen, so I guess there's validity in that. But in reality, the reason why I prefer or I require dual card slots for the work that I do is less about card failure and more about being able to continue to shoot in a moment where light's changing or you have a subject kind of lining up perfectly. So what I mean by that is that here with the Sonys, I can have my first card set to be shooting normally, shooting my RAW or RAW and JPEG depending on what I'm doing. And then my second card, I can have it set to automatically begin to fill that card once the first card gets filled. So how many times have you been shooting and all of a sudden you get that card, that error that your card is full? Even if you have your card on you, it's going to take a couple seconds to swap it out and put it in there. When I have dual card slots and I have the second slot to continuously fill when the first card slot gets full, then I'm not missing that extra moment, or at least have another opportunity to make sure my cards are changed out. So that's why I feel the dual card slots is important for this type of stuff. And additionally, when we're talking about cards, making sure your cards themselves can handle the environments. Now most SD cards can handle your basic stuff, getting a little bit wet, sometimes even going through the washing machine, but they're still brittle. They still can break under extreme pressure. Sony's new tough cards, which you guys can actually see behind you here, are quite phenomenally. They're almost just about indestructible. They don't have the little rids and the guidelines on the back anymore. They're kind of nice and flat, so there's not another breaking point that you typically get with a lot of SD cards. So if you want to make sure that you're working with your cameras can handle the environments, you're dressing appropriately, you're bringing the right bags and tripods, your SD cards also matter as well in a situation like this. So I also want to talk about battery life. So a lot of people don't necessarily focus on the idea that mirrorless cameras are very power intensive. Unlike a digital SLR, mirrorless cameras are purely digital, so everything runs through those batteries. And it can be really hard and drain a lot of battery life. Now, up until the third generation of Sony's mirrorless cameras, they too suffered from the same thing that the rest of the industry suffers from currently, which is the fact that these batteries drain a little bit faster than SLRs. What Sony did with the Sony Z100 batteries, not only did they completely reconfigure the battery as well as the wiring, but they also completely redeveloped their power management system. So this camera, this battery is built for mirrorless cameras with this extra power drain. And when you look at the new entries into the mirrorless market in the near history, you realize that they're using digital SLR batteries in a mirrorless world, so you're not going to get the same amount of use out of them in terms of actually shots. So with the Z100 battery, I can often get a couple thousand images per battery, which is kind of a big deal when you're working off the grid. You get a couple different batteries, and then you don't have to worry too much about plugging in your camera. But if you do, a really interesting thing that you can do with Sony's that you can't do with just about any other mirrorless camera is that not only can I plug my Sony camera into like an Anchor power brick or something like that, the same ones you guys charge your phones with, into your micro USB port, but I can actually externally run my Sony camera from plugging in that same power brick. So let's say you wanted to do a time lapse that was 5 hours long or 10 hours long at night. You can't do that with other cameras out there because the battery will drain too fast, whether because of the cold or the duration that you're shooting. For Sony, I not only can do that, I can externally power it for a long process like that, but if I'm out shooting and I know that I'm draining one of my batteries, I'm throwing my camera into my bag, I can plug it in, literally plug my camera into one of those power bricks and then charge it as I go to my next spot, which is a big deal again. So dealing with harsh weather. So harsh weather, again, is really challenging for most electronic devices, so how do you deal with that? When it comes to Sony, I'm constantly working, again, in environments that are wet and hot and humid. There's a lot of dust. So what's the number one thing that I need to make sure that I have taken care of is actually making sure that our hot shoe cover here at the top is actually on secure. A lot of people don't think about that, especially if you guys are doing portrait work and working with flashes. You do your flash work, you pull it off, you don't think about it. In reality, those are exposed terminals sitting at the top of your camera. So make sure you have that hot shoe protection cover. If you've lost it, you can buy them online for like B&H for like $5 or Amazon. But make sure you have that because you're going to make sure that your gear is protected and can handle these environments. Additionally, let's talk a little bit about native lenses. So this is a photograph taken on, it was Abraham Lake in the Canadian Rockies. Again, super cold. I didn't necessarily have to worry too much about rain and dust and things like that. But the reality is that when you're using third-party lenses, the problem is not necessarily the lenses themselves. because all the other camera manufacturers out there, the vast majority of them, are creating weather-sealed lenses. The issue is the adapters. So when you're using an adapter with some of these cameras, you don't necessarily know the construction quality, you don't know what specs they're using for those adapters, and that could potentially be a weak point when it comes to letting in weather, letting in moisture, letting in dust. So when it comes to native lenses or using native lenses on a Sony system, if you're moving from another system, it's a great stopgap solution to kind of not have to spend a lot of money replacing your entire lens lineup right away. But the goal ultimately should always be to use native lenses, not only to take advantage of all the auto-focusing features and the other features that are tied to using native glass, but also because you want to remove those potential weak points in your system so you don't have to deal with things like ocean spray and stuff like that. And the last thing I would say is to be proactive. And what I mean by that is that when I get done shooting in a situation where it was pouring rain, or I'm shooting seascapes and there's, saltwater splashes from the waves, or I'm in the middle of Sahara in East Africa, after I'm done shooting, I'm going to make sure that I have a couple microfiber cloths that I'm going to clean off my camera, and then maybe I'll use a rocket blower, and I'll kind of blow off some of the dust or some of the water out of the little button recesses and things like that, and then I'll have some silicone gel, little packets sitting in my bag. And the reason that this is important is because I see a lot of photographers out there, and I teach a lot of workshops around the world, so we get done in this challenging environment, and they're exhausted and you're tired, and you get back to the car and your camera's soaking or it's wet, it's cold. And they take that camera, they open up their camera backpack, they stick it into their camera backpack, they close it and they seal it, and then they jump in the car. And what happens in those moments is that all that moisture is just festering inside your bag, ultimately potentially leading to issues with moisture getting inside your lenses, potentially getting inside your body, and all sorts of other issues. So instead, taking just a couple moments after you're done working in a challenging environment, cleaning your gear, drying it off a little bit, and then when you put it inside your bag, if you have the ability, leave your bag open and let it naturally aerate, and you're not going to have any issues, or you have much less chance of having issues ruining your gear. So I literally, as I mentioned, traveled to the 4 corners of the globe. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be up in the Canadian Arctic photographing polar bears. A few weeks after that, I'm going to be down in Antarctica, the Falkland Islands, and South Georgia. Q1 and Q2 of next year, you're going to see me in Iceland, in Norway above the Arctic Circle, in Patagonia for a month of April. And all throughout this process, I'm using all of my Sony gear, doing the same exact thing that I used, the same exact workflow that I used when I shot with digital SLRs back in the day. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to take my gear, I'm going to confidently use it in these challenging environments, but I'm also going to take care of it. I'm going to make sure that after the fact, they're going to be clean and dry so that I can use them for the next month. So that was my talk. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have any questions about working in these challenging places, you can find me over on the side, and I'll also be talking later today, talking about wildlife photography as well. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.